Welcome to the SIWIKE Podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE Podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here with our new guest host, Daivik. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Luki?
I'm doing phenomenal as always. So Daivik comes to us from a background in CS, startups, podcasting, a bunch of other things. So what are you up to these days, Daivik?
Yeah, right now I just recently, left my job a couple months ago. I want to always do my own startup, and we can get into that. But I'm in between startup ideas right now. I'm playing around with different problem spaces, and exploring different ideas to build them.
Sounds good. So a work in progress and probably a follow-up episode to catch up on what you have built things into. But I'd love if we rewinded and talk a little bit about yourself as a kid. So what were you like growing up? What are some early fond childhood memories?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Calgary. For those of you who don't know, it's west side of Canada, and it's a very much of an oil and gas city. So.
Right.
I was like that one, I guess one unicorn, in a bunch of, a bunch of horses, I guess, because everybody wanted to go work in oil and gas, right? Everybody's making great money in it. Even now it's a pretty good industry to get into, but especially back then. And I was that one kid, like, no, I want to go work in tech. And everybody used to look at me like, why? Like,
why? Yeah.
Why wouldn't you just go work in oil and gas? And so, I knew that from a very early age. I, growing up, I was playing like Space Invaders on Windows 2000 or XP back in the day. So like I've always had this affinity with computers and technology. But as I grew up, I realized that no, I think this is what I want to do in my life. Like I said, I was one of the only people like that growing up. Eventually when I got through, middle school, high school, obviously had a great time with technology, was even more profound, like more set on doing that. And then I went to the Waterloo for computer engineering. And very, very quickly I realized that, even though I had an affinity towards technology growing up, I didn't actually know anything about building it. And, especially nowadays, everybody's programming from a young age. I feel like anywhere, whether it's Calgary or wherever, just because it's gotten so much traction. But back, not that long ago, but even in 2016, when I first joined Waterloo, I had no programming experience. And the reason is that places like Calgary, for example, didn't people just didn't know about it.
Okay.
And so that was, a big change for me, having to learn actually how to build technology, not only how it works or from a feature level or what are the cool stuff coming out. So it was definitely an interesting journey growing up there, but that's sort of where it got started, and eventually where it led to.
Sounds good. And I love if we unpack that a little bit, because we kind of glossed over a whole bunch of things. So I'd love if you take us back and talk a little bit about kind of going against the grain, right? So everybody is going into oil and gas, and you're kind of as you said, the unicorn amongst horses, and you want to get into tech. So what was that process like? Were your parents influencing you to go to oil and gas, or they were very supportive to get into tech, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, I think, my dad's an oil and gas engineer. And so, of course, the oil and gas has paid the bills for a very long time. Yeah. But at the same time, I think my parents have been pretty supportive in what I wanted to do. And, it'd be very different, if I wanted to make a career singing or something like that. I'm sure we would have an interesting conversation growing up. But, doing stuff in computers still, people still knew, okay, it's somewhat lucrative, right? They might just not have the full scope like they do now.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely going against the grain was, I'm not gonna sit here and say that, oh wow, like, I was ostracized or something like that. I wasn't. Like, it was just like, it's people were confused about. But it did mean that I had to have a lot of self-conviction, because when the people around you are like, okay, this is a great path to take, it's very easy to also go along with them, right? But when they don't have any context in terms of what you want to do or that path that you want to take, you have to have a lot more self-conviction, or find sources outside of your local community, which, nowadays is not as hard, but especially back in the day, was to do that. And I think, the rise of YouTube and just the internet in general, definitely helped me with that,
Right.
because I was able to get exposed to ideas and just events and stuff and people that I wouldn't have been able to get exposed to earlier on. But yeah, definitely. Like I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, and I'd love if you share a little bit more about how you were able to demonstrate your convictions. So surrounding yourself with like YouTube influencers that are kind of hyping up tech and all that stuff can only go so far.
Yeah.
Or was it just that, like saying, hey, look, mom and dad, or look, all my friends, like tech is a big thing. Like that's what all these YouTubers are saying. Like, how did you demonstrate or even get that self-conviction?
Well, first off, shout out MKBHD because, he's, I've been following for a very long time. So definitely having his videos there was very cool. And I think, it was small things, right? Like if you go to the mall, right? And there's like a store, a tech store, going in and actually like seeing the tech in person and like playing around with the features. Even now, whenever I do that, my friends are like, dude, why are you wasting our time? Like, why are you going in and checking this out? And I get excited about the little features, right? And so like, that conviction, even when I was a kid, was a big deal because I think that's a constant reminder why you want to get into something. And those experience that I got to experience as a kid, or even now when I pick up a piece of tech, that helped reinforce that. So, yeah, totally. Like, obviously YouTubers and stuff was a big part there, but small things like that, I think kept me in that loop as well.
Sounds good. And you mentioned that you ended up at Waterloo, which is probably one of the highest rated computer programs in Canada. And what was the transition like from Calgary into Waterloo? Because I don't know, is it a normal path? Obviously, folks are trying to get to oil and gas, right? So that's a little bit different. But were you pretty academic at school? You had good grades? It was easy to get in? Or what was that process like to get into the Waterloo Comp Eng program?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot more competitive now. It was pretty competitive back then too, and I had good grades. I was always known as such smart kid in class. And I think a lot of Waterloo people probably share that just because of how competitive everything is. But yeah, I think what's interesting to me is that for a lot of people, they don't know what they want to do growing up, and like I mentioned, I was very clear about it that I wanted to do computer engineering from a very young age. In fact, a good story around that was that in grade 9, my dad just casually asked, what do you want to do? Like, are you thinking about things? And then he mentioned that, okay, why don't you make a list of like, universities, because you want to do computer engineering, like what universities you want to go to. And I think my list went something along the lines of like, okay, I want to go to like Stanford, MIT, like Berkeley, and then like the one Canadian university there was Waterloo. So, like I was very set on that to begin with. And the whole point of doing that was just to get me to those companies or to get me to that area, like the Bay Area, right, where I could really start working on the tech I grew up with. And so, yeah, when I got into Waterloo, it was like more of a, rather than more of a surprise, I guess, it was more of like, okay, this is part of the plan. So it was really, it was obviously great to have that, but, I always had that expectation growing up for myself. But I think, it's interesting and we can dive into this, but when I first got into Waterloo, it was definitely a big change for me, for both from like a personality point of view for me and just my life in general. So, I'm happy to dive into that a little bit, but that was sort of the process getting to Waterloo. It was very much part of the plan for me growing up.
Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit. So you mentioned before that you're in Waterloo, and I mean, there's an expectation that you know how to code, but you mentioned that your previous schooling didn't really emphasize that because it was probably more oil and gas, that sort of thing. So what was the going on in your head where you're in the school where everybody knows how to code, they're all building these amazing things, and you haven't yet got into the mix of things? So what was that kind of first couple of months like in starting Waterloo?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, like you mentioned, I didn't know how to code, and I think so. Back then, they actually still had 2 programs. They had like within first year, they still had like one set, which is just people who know how to program. So it was a little bit more tougher material for them, and then people who don't know how to program. So the course is a little bit easier. I don't even know if they have that anymore because I think it's like almost an expectation at this point that you know how to code coming into Waterloo. But even then, right, like you're surrounded by people who have the same thinking, but they definitely I had more of a theoretical, like, and not even theoretical in terms of building, but just like in terms of features I'd like to see or just tech in general. They had more of an application there. So there was definitely a little bit of an imposter syndrome because the passion was there, but the ability wasn't at the time. So trying to build that up was a huge thing. But I think in general, one thing that sort of shattered me at the time, to be honest, right, and I had to rebuild myself is, like I said, I always had this identity of being the smart kid in class, right, and doing all of this. And the moment I came to Waterloo, I remember coming in and I was like, oh, like I'll easily get, like 80s, 90s and like have a good time, because everybody used to tell me that, hey, it's really tough. You're probably gonna get 60s, you might fail, like all this might happen. But in my head, I'm, and this is what happens, right? When you grow up around an environment where everybody's like, oh, this is sick, you're doing well. In my head, I was like, they don't really know what they're talking about, right? Like they don't know me or whatever, right?
Right.
So I came into first semester, and what I quickly realized that, oh no, they were right. And like I got my first midterm back, and it sort of crushed me a little bit, because not only, of course, because of the threat of failing looming on because of all those midterm marks,
right.
But second, just because my identity was so wrapped around that it was sort of a big pivot moment for me. And so, I think Waterloo first semester was definitely an interesting time, both from the perspective of, being surrounded by talent and that being inspiring, but at the same time, really nerve wracking. But second, in terms of me actually like sitting down and figuring out, okay, I can't just be defined by being the smart kid in class or by marks. Right. What am I actually like? What do I care about? And I think that's paid a lot of dividends in the years and even now.
That's awesome. And I mean, for those that know my story, I have a similar one. First year, I almost failed out of my first year. And yeah, those marks were not nice to get through. And having been, as you said, crushed or like punched in the face a few times, what was the process to rebuild yourself? So you talked about like taking the time to find out what you actually cared about. Was that like a conscious effort, like you took the afternoon, the weekend, went off to the woods and did that, or was that like over time? What was that process like for you?
No, it was definitely an overtime process. So to give you a little context, I guess, so in the first semester, the marks thing happened. I barely passed, by the way, at the end. But I did make it by the skin of my teeth. But that happened, and in general, like it wasn't a good time because moved away from home.
Sure.
A lot of people, they're going through a lot of stuff, and sometimes that comes on you, right? So it was just an interesting time in general for a lot of different people, especially in my circle. And so like there's a lot of different areas there. Obviously stress, a lot of, the phenomenon of freshman 15, all of that type of stuff, right? So a lot of different things were going on. And at the same time, actually at Waterloo, we come in and we try finding our first co-op from the get-go. If you're in forestry in engineering, and co-op's mandatory. So I went from never having a job to having to find one 2 weeks into university, right? And so I eventually found one, which is great. And I really, I still can't believe I got it, but, it was definitely a very stressful time. So, what happened is, I barely passed by the skin of my teeth. And the good thing was, and this definitely, definitely helped a lot during my whole Waterloo experience, that I still made great friends in my first semester. In fact, friends that I still talk with today and like I'm very close with, right? So they were essential getting me through that semester and even to the end. But yeah, basically, like I came back. It was my first co-op. Barely made a skin on teeth. I was in Toronto at the time for my first co-op, and there's just different steps that I took there. So the first one being was, okay, like I put on a bunch of weight for freshman 15. My mind's out of place, like whatever, right? Like I made sure to make my health an active thing that I focused on, and I think that was a big thing at the time, because I think when your whole life sort of scattered around, you got to pick and choose one thing, and start building that up rapidly, or start building everything up slowly, right? And so I chose that as a big thing at the time, and so I think that helped me clear my mind and like find a goal to work towards again. And then second, like I realized that like I'm not like I'm not this I'm not the studious type. Like I always need to study, but that's not me. So I decided to explore more ideas, whether it be like just general walking around Toronto and just like trying to talk to people, or just seeing random stuff, because at the time it was my first time in Toronto, so it was very cool to do that in the bigger city after living in Calgary. Right. Or just reaching out to people online as well, and just like trying to get more insight into the way they operate and the way they work, whether it be in tech or different fields. So I think that's sort of the steps I took there, but slowly, I rebuilt myself. I was more mentally prepared when I went back for my second semester in the summer. And yeah, like I had the great friends to lean on as well. So that's sort of how I got back.
Sounds good. So what I took from that is having a lot of great friends, surrounding yourself with great people to help in that rebuild process is helpful. And then taking your health as a priority, that can be super helpful as well.
Yeah.
And obviously pick your strengths. So you realize you weren't studious. Let's go explore. Let's go talk to people. That's where you kind of learned the most and got the most out of it. So that was helpful in rebuilding. I'd love if you kind of went back to some of the working side, because with folks, with students in general, like the first job is always the hardest, right? Because you have zero experience. You're trying to prove yourself. And you said you somehow lucked out to get the job. Yeah. Can you describe a little bit more about that process? Like, could you share some advice to the young Daiviks out there who are like, oh man, I'm struggling to land my first role?
Yep.
Talk to us a little bit more about that process and what to do, what not to do as you find that first role.
Yeah, I think your first job's really interesting. I think you look like, okay, what are the resume tips I can do, or like, what are the interview tips I can do, all this type of stuff, which is really important. Don't get me wrong, right? But with your first job, because you don't have that much experience to begin with, it's really just somebody taking a risk and gamble on you, right? Yeah. And they're like, okay, let me, help this kid out and help him get started. Or, honestly, sometimes it's more like, how can I get some free labor real quick? But, there's a lot of free labor out there, right? So they still have to take a chance on you to do that, right? And so, I think, students sort of kick themselves in the back, especially in the first year, especially at Waterloo, right? Where you have to get something immediately. When it comes to this, and I think the big thing I always tell them is, it's part of the process. It's not easy to get your first job, and it's not easy to get somebody to gamble on you like that. And so when you're coming in, the first thing is get your resume torn apart, because usually it's probably gonna be terrible. I went to a bunch of review sessions in the first couple of weeks, and I think that helped me a lot. You will get conflicting information sometimes, though, so sometimes you got to just make sense of it and try doing things that you think makes sense, or you think aligns to you. And then second, go obviously go do the interview workshops and stuff. But after that, like it's really just a process of like sticking with the system and keep trying and seeing what happens. Because like I mentioned, it's not easy. So, it's just going to take some time to get to that point. And if it doesn't happen, so be it, right? Like there's a lot of different steps you can take, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. But yeah, stick with the system and see what happens. And it's funny because the reason I was laughing is because my story about how I got my first job was that I had the system every time I went to these interviews that I just ended up developing, where, obviously I used to wear the suit and everything, which I now realize is maybe not the best thing in tech, but okay, whatever. Like, it's always best to dress better than your interviewer, or at least make sure you're equating to them, right? So a suit's sort of the best way of doing that. Not that I'd recommend it anymore. But I also had this other thing where I used to bring my resume to every single interview, like a printed copy of my resume, because it was in person at the time. And all my friends used to be like, why are you doing this, right? Like, they'll have your resume printed out. They already have it from beforehand. Waterloo sends it from beforehand, so they'll print it out. I'm like, I don't know, like if they need it, like I should just have it. And I did, like, I was lucky in first year. I got a decent amount of interviews to begin with. So I had like 5 or 6 at the time. So I went to like 4 or 5 interviews, and with my resume, never needed it. It was sort of just more of a precaution. But this last interview, the job I actually got, when I came in, the first thing they asked is, oh, do you have a copy of your resume? And so I gave it to them, and they were like, oh, wow, like you're actually one of the first people, or the only people who actually did that or had a copy of their resume. And I think that, solely that basically, and obviously our conversation went okay as well, was the reason they decided to take a chance on me and give me my first co-op. So sometimes it can be really arbitrary reasons, like I contribute to the resume workshops, I contribute to the interviews, but those small things sometimes that can make the biggest difference. And it's not something you can necessarily calculate, right? Like, the resume thing worked for me, but it might not necessarily be the differentiating factor for you, right? But it's just about sticking with the system and the process and trusting into it, and eventually knowing it'll work out.
For sure. Again, a lot to unpack in there. So some of the things were to take advantage of the resources available. So to Career Center, Co-op Office, whatever, getting your resume critiqued multiple times, right? And making sense of that conflicting information. Because as you said, like someone will say 2-page resume, someone will say 1-page resume, someone will say 2-column, 1-column, and blah, blah, blah. So you really have to make sense of whatever advice for your particular context. And then interview workshops, for me, interviewing is all about practice, right? So doing it again. Tell me about yourself. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Make sure you have all of those really buttoned up, and then you'll be set up for success for those questions. You're like, oh, I don't know about this one. Let me try to figure that one. And sticking with the system, I have my own story of that where I was actually on the other side. So for those that know my story, I used to run the undergrad campus recruiting program at Deloitte. And as part of that, we would manage the interviews coming in. Sometimes I would do them, sometimes I wouldn't. And for whatever reason, one of the interviews was late and there's something with the room booking or whatever. So I was managing the process. And they said, okay, they're not here yet. Can you just go into this room and interview? It's like, great. And they forgot to give me the package with the resume and stuff. So I'm interviewing someone who I have no idea. I just got told like 2 minutes before that I was doing it. And would you have a copy of your resume? And he did. Right? Okay. So, and obviously it turned out into, well, not obviously, but it turned out to be a good interview. And I believe that we hired them. So oftentimes, a lot of folks will say it's all done electronically, it's all whatever. But it's that one time that you need it, that you wish that you had it. So make sure, even if you waste a few trees, unfortunately, right, if you're in person, it often does help out. So I'm glad that was something that was successful for you. And I'd love if you walk us through a couple of like the meaningful learnings from the various places that you work. So like the D&D, Shaw, IBM, Tesla, Cisco, Meraki, and stuff like that. Like what are some of the key learnings that you had in your co-op terms?
It's a pretty loaded question because there's definitely a lot. And I think the big thing is, in general for internships, you'll learn this very quickly. There's 2 types of internships. One where you're just strictly basically focusing on learning and building your skill. Of course, you're applying that as well. But I think at a certain point, and this probably happened to me around my 4th or 5th internship, at a certain point you reach this threshold where like you have built up to almost to the full-time level. So your internships quickly change from learning to application and actually like using the knowledge you have from your previous internships or the ones you gained during this one or during the one you're working at into applying and actually like doing meaningful work for companies. Right. And so what I'd say is the first, like I mentioned, the first 3 internships are very much on the learning stage. Where, I'd say like, my first co-op was just me getting into actual how programming works on an application level, because, I learned C++ for the first time in my first semester, but that semester, the first co-op term is when I actually learned how to build applications. And then it's really important because, of course that builds towards actually, actually doing your own thing later or where I am today. Second one at the D&D at the time, it was like it was an incubator program that they had for innovation. Okay. So I think that was really cool for me. Is that co-op term was very much me finding out how startups work, because even though we were part of the government, we were just a group of 3 interns trying to build a project out based on a prompt, pretty much, and they didn't have any technical experience. So that was very cool for me. And then as the co-ops went along, like I'm not going to regurgitate my resume, but there's definitely different aspects that I learned there. And talking about more of the bigger companies, with IBM and Tesla and Cisco, I think I learned how like I think these companies have a very special culture and a very special execution that make them successful. Especially something like Tesla, right? I think what Tesla does really well is that even today, even being however big of an organization they are, they've retained that startup culture where people are trying to push as far as they can. get things out the door and get into the hands of customers, which, that's for the better and for worse. You can be the judge of that. I'm not going to go into that, but it's definitely a very interesting thing to learn during the co-op terms. And I think that's what's really cool with the co-op term. You get to learn all these different ways that different companies work and get things done, and then you can start thinking about how you want what style works for you, and how you can apply it later on. So I think the big companies are very cool for that, especially for me, because that was a moment where I got to work on tech that I grew up with, and in general, like, got to get the insight there. But that's what I would say in general.
Yeah, what I took from that is, well, for all the students out there, learn as much and then take the latter half to apply. So this is obviously inbuilt to kind of the Waterloo system, where you have like 5 or 6 co-op terms, whereas some other programs might only have 2 or 3, and some might not even have any. So you need to make sure you take advantage of summer internships or any sort of work-related opportunities, but make sure that you spend as much time learning as you can, how to be a professional, how to manage your time, how to understand requirements and build relationships and things like that. Yeah. And then as you get later on, well, start putting into practice and adding some helpful features or functions, or building interesting things that could be helpful to the organization.
And I think, sort of to add to that as well, I think, what I recommend students to do, and might be a little bit of a controversial one depending who you talk to, but the first couple co-ops, I would completely focus on, like, okay, what is the experience you can get and how your manager is. And I know it's really hard to base that off one or 2 interviews, but your manager, especially, to begin with, will be the ones setting you up in situations where you can excel. And so I would really focus on that, because if you have a bad manager who doesn't teach you anything, you're not going to learn anything, and you're going to go to your second co-op term sort of having to either do your own projects and on your own learning experience, or like just at a disadvantage there. So focus on your manager, focus on the experience you're getting for the first couple co-op terms, and then this is where the controversial part comes up. For the second half, I would actually focus on getting pretty good names on your resume if you can. I'd focus on that half, because that gives you credibility. And I think when you can lean on your experience as a way for credibility, but the truth of the matter is, when people look at these big companies at a certain light, so when you have that credibility, it just opens the doors in terms of what you could do in the future. And so the good thing with internships is that it obviously the curve to get in is a lot lower compared to a full-time job, and the and the commitment level is also only a 4-month period. And so, after 4 months, you can always go to a different company or try something else. But the moment you have that, is just a certain level of credibility that you have established. So that's how I'd do my internships, or how I did my internships, I guess. And that's probably what I recommend students to do as well.
Yeah, I think for internships, there's a balance between kind of the experience itself and kind of the prestige of the brand that's supposedly providing you that experience. And to have at least one kind of big name, whether it's a big bank, a big tech, a big whatever, can really help unlock your resume, even though if you had 5, 6 amazing work terms, of which nobody knows any of them, well, that speaks a little bit differently than at least you have one, like the Teslas, the IBMs, the Microsoft, whatever, the FANG, Manga, whatever the new acronyms are.
One of those, yeah.
Obviously for tech, and then for your respective industry, having a big name, like the Big Four, the Big Five banks, or whatever, could be super helpful. So fast forward to today, now you're more into the startup world and now working on a few projects. So we'll kind of park that for a little bit. But I'd love if you chatted a little bit about the podcasting stuff that you've done. So you've been involved in a couple of podcasts, and we'd love if you shared a little bit of your experience on that side.
Totally, yeah. So when we left off in the story, is on 2017, I had my first co-op. Started exploring more ideas, more different things people working on. And I think what ended up happening is basically still took me a couple of semesters to get comfortable with the notion of school. But at a certain point, I was like, okay, I think I understand school. I know what to do. So I can take on more things. And I've always been crazy about tech. Even growing up, right? I love talking about ideas, different concepts that different companies are using, or just different tech coming out. And I realized, honestly, that I was boring my friends by doing that, because even in computer engineering or any of the engineerings, like they, a lot of people just, they want to learn the concepts, do their job, and be done. Like they don't, it's not like a huge passion for them, right? You'll learn that very quickly, depending on the people you're talking with. And I realized that, okay, there are other people out there who are passionate about the stuff, right? And so that's when I started exploring more about making my own Medium articles and just talking about different trends in technology, and just talking with random people online on LinkedIn or something like that. And that's my journey started. So I started doing that for a bit. I made a article. My first article was basically the buzzwords in tech, because at the time everybody was throwing AI, machine learning, or at the time it was actually IoT. Everything was IoT. Now AI, machine learning has sort of come into sub for that. So anyway, I was just talking about how we keep using these buzzwords, but it actually depends what the value is to the customer. And you can't just use the buzzwords to sell stuff. There actually has to be an inherent customer value there. But anyway, that's sort of how it started off. And then what happened is, at the same time, I decided to talk about my experiences with internships and job interviews and stuff, because of this, crazy cycle that Waterloo goes through. And I realized that a lot of students were just asking me those same questions, very, similar, like, how can I improve my resume? How can I, get into these companies doing, whatever. And I got basically tired of just telling the same thing over and over again. And I realized in September 2019, when I started my first podcast, that, hey, why don't I just podcast out here and tell students about talk to students about internships, and talk with other students who are doing internships that students want to do, like your Apples and Googles or whatever. And so that's where my first podcast started. It was called The Almost Dropouts, very reflective of my own journey in September 2019. And that was a time before COVID as well, where I think, podcasting was big, but not the student side. I think that really grew during COVID, and a lot more podcasts popped up. But at the time, there wasn't that many out there. And so started with that. And yeah, it is, it just grew from there. So eventually it brought me to doing my second podcast eventually, and I can get into why I switched. But yeah, that's where it started.
Yeah, so it sounds like finding your tribe, your group of passionate people that are willing to listen to your so-called boring stories, right? Because there are people around that will do it for the job, for the money, for the whatever. But there are tons of passionate people out there. So if you can find your tribe, so to speak, then there are more than enough people to listen there. And I love, as we start to wrap up the story, you mentioned a little bit about having substance behind kind of the buzzwords. And when we were talking off air, you talked a little bit about your last startup, which you had lots of marketing pizzazz, but less substance. If you could share a little bit about that, and share a little bit of your most recent startup journey for the listeners.
Yeah, I recently put out a tweet like a couple of weeks ago, where I was saying, doing a startup feels like I'm back in 1A or back in my first semester at Waterloo. And it's a good thing, right? Like, I also have a lot of memories and a lot of experience I can dig behind, but still, like, it's like, when I was at Waterloo, I'm at the bottom of the mountain, slowly and arduously climb up the mountain, somewhat, I'm able to make the best advantage of it, defeat that mountain per se. And then, you look up, and now here's another mountain you have to climb again, right? That's what the startup journey felt like. But yeah, I think the big thing there, and you learn very quickly, is, you can market stuff, you can do whatever, but at the end of the day, it's about, are you solving a customer problem, and are you solving it really well? And I think, as engineers, we always defer to, creating cool stuff that we really like, using technologies that we like, and just trying to make it as groundbreaking as possible from an engineering point of view. But the moment you start actually taking those projects and putting into actually a full-fledged startup, it's a whole different game. And so, with my first startup, it was basically working with this other guy. He had the idea and he was just working on it. It was essentially a student freelance marketplace. And it was based on a lot of my experiences there too, where I realized, at that third or fourth internship, students are basically, in my opinion, almost like full-time employees or like new grads.
Sure.
So they have a lot of the skills that they need in order to be freelancers if that's a career path that they want to take. And a lot of them are considering that. But, current platforms like Upwork and Fiverr aren't really able to do that for students because the way their algorithm ranks different freelancers. So yeah, that was my thesis there. And I think what was really interesting is first, if you're doing a startup, a two-sided marketplace is a really hard thing to do as your first startup. So I'll give a caution to that if you are planning to do your own. But the second thing is, when I first joined, I thought that there was a little bit more validation on the client side of things, just because for me, the student side was very obvious, but the client side was the tough part. And I realized that, no, we had to do a lot more validation there, on the client side. And as we talked to more clients, there was definitely a big issue in terms of a gap, between students really wanting it, but the clients not necessarily needing it, or, working with students more on a pro bono basis. So anyway, that was that startup. And, after talking to clients, I realized that, okay, I think we have to heavily pivot out of this idea or leave the idea. And that's eventually what I did. So anyway, big learnings there is, as an engineer, we always default to creating solutions, but really understand the problem. And I think my approach now is like, look at problem spaces, find smaller problems in the problem space, which, are hair on fire. People are really annoyed with it, or like they hate it, they want it solved. But it might not necessarily be the huge, the multi-billion-dollar company that you're thinking about, but solve those problems first. And you can usually do that with smaller software solutions rather than building a huge monolith. And then after that, my plan is, okay, solve the problem. Hopefully customers are responding well. So there's some type of, recurring revenue from that. Now build onto that, right? And there's if the problem space is big enough, there's different sides you can probably bring into it, or take your solution and bring it to a different problem. But there's a lot of paths you can take. But it's a huge shift there. It's like a really distinct shift, because every engineering job is just about building solutions, but not about necessarily talking to the customer or going from the ground up from a problem point of view. So it's a very different mentality that I've now adopted after my first startup.
For sure. And that's probably a whole episode on its own, going through kind of product market fit, where, as you said, a lot of engineers, computer folks are looking at the product, looking at the solution. Hey, a lot of people want and buy this, versus, hey, is there actually a problem? Is the market willing to pay to have this problem solved? If you start there, then often the solution will possibly be different than what you expect it to be, but that'll probably be a clearer path to sustained growth later on. So, Daivik, as we close off this podcast, I'd love if you shared a little bit of the SIWIKE, the stuff I wish I knew earlier. I know you already shared a bunch of it, but if there's any that you wanted to add, or any that you wanted to emphasize, for those out there who are in tech, looking to go against the grain in the startup world, maybe one or two of your SIWIKE, the stuff I wish I knew earlier, that you'd want to share and emphasize.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Luki, I could probably do a whole couple podcasts about that. And yeah, I shared a lot of that stuff on my social media or articles and stuff as well. But yeah, I think big level ones. First one is and I think you get a little bit more perspective of this in Waterloo at the end. Is I was in this rush when I first came in. I've always wanted to work at the big companies, but at a certain point, you end up doing stuff because everybody else wants to do it. And I think one of the things I now recommend, students is, play the game, go through your internships, get past it. Like I mentioned, credibility experience is huge there. But at a certain point, you can now decide what you want to do and really sit down and figure that out. I think, I'm 24 right now, but I think this is a special time between 18 and where I am right now, 24, but I'm sort of at the closing end of that window where you bring this youthful energy and this and this ability to be molded to some degree. So people love working with people who are younger, right? And if you have ideas you want to bring into the world, or you want to do things, that's a really special time to do it in, or to get support in it. And I think as you start getting older, and I've started realizing this very quickly, a lot of people are talking about what value can you deliver to me today, rather than looking at your potential that you have when you're younger. And so take advantage of that. If you're smart with it, I think there's a lot of benefits there. And so if there's certain things you want to do, definitely go try pursuing it, especially when you're younger. And that's part of the reason why I decided to leave my job and do startups, because I realized that I'm at the end of that window and things just get tougher later on. So I should take advantage of that. I think the second thing I realized is a lot of stuff, but like I think the second thing I realized is that you can get as much theory as you want. You can listen to as many podcasts, this podcast, my podcast, whatever podcast, right? You can understand how the system works, how the game works, or like if it's more of a tech or startup podcast. Okay, how do I find startup problems? How do I find problem market? Whatever. But until you actually do things, it is very different. And I think, one of the big issues I've seen, or one of the big downfalls I've seen for a lot of people is, like, for example, with my podcast, right? I had an idea. I came up with what I think it would look like, but I actually executed on it and I decided to build it. And I think a lot of people, what they end up doing is they just leave that in the shop, where they get stuck on making things so perfect or making it, amazing to begin with, that it just never actually comes out, and they never actually make anything. It just stays in the shop and it just never amounts to anything. And that's the thing, right? Like, you won't figure things out until you start the podcast, start building whatever solution you have out, and put it out there and get feedback. You won't know what direction it can go in, and just ways you can improve, and where the podcast will go. So I would say, if you have anything like that, just get it out there. Like, think about it and then get it out there as soon as you can, because things evolve very quickly. And if it's just in the shop, it's no use to anybody, and it's just gonna sit there, right? So I think that's another big thing that I wish I knew earlier, but I think I learned at a decent time. So
sounds good. Again, a lot more to unpack in that as well. So what I took from that is take your time. Don't be in a rush, but also take advantage of that useful energy, right? So follow your curiosity, interest, excitement, and showcase a little bit about that passion. Don't be afraid to say, you know what, I really love doing this stuff. Can I find that? And if you showcase a lot of that, employers often want to hire that versus your resume and the things that you would have done, because they'd rather see that potential and that passion versus the demonstrated boringness of some of the other things that's there. And then the other part is obviously the difference between theory and execution, right? Instead of just looking at the books, passing the tests and all that, go ahead and do, right? So whether it's on the weekend and hack something together if you're someone in tech, but don't be that wantrepreneur where you kind of have this idea that you're perfecting in the back and putting it on the shelf and pulling it off once in a while, versus actually getting it out into the wild, testing that product market fit, getting the feedback. Sometimes the bad feedback is just as important as the good one, because maybe it should do this or that or whatever. That can be super helpful in getting things done. So we're very thankful that you're able to share some of your SIWIKE, Daivik. So wondering if you could share with folks what you're going to be up to in the future. Obviously a little bit in stealth mode right now, so maybe just in at a high level. And then where can folks reach out to you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, for sure. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm in between startup ideas right now, looking at different problem spaces, trying to make smaller solutions. Just looking into that. But otherwise, I have a podcast as well. It's called the Building Blocks Podcast. Actually, I never finished the story about my from my first podcast to this one, but basically I got tired of talking about internships and I wanted to talk strictly about tech and product building. If you want to learn about internships, the old podcast is still up, but this one is strictly about product-based building philosophies and the way different people in tech go about doing it. So if you want to check that out, that's it's obviously a good time. I've also started a newsletter recently, just because it was hard to find. A lot of people are asking me about IRL events, and especially in the Toronto area. So I've decided to host some of my own and to showcase some of the ones that I think are interesting. So, I do that in my newsletter as well, put a small article about whatever I'm working with. Very recently, my last newsletter, I talked about solutions in search of a problem. So that's definitely something I've been grappling with and sort of, I've alluded to during this podcast. But if you want more of a deep dive in that, you can check it out there. And then otherwise, just connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever. I like to think I sometimes I drop some cool nuggets there, we can talk about, or cool talking points. But if you want to check it out, feel free to do that. And if I can help in any way, feel free to reach out to me as well.
Sounds good. We're looking forward to the updates and hearing more from you, and hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me, Luki.
Thanks, Daivik.
Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.